Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Leisure Suit Larry Goes Looking for Love, in several wrong places, for DOS, Amiga, and Atari ST. This is an adventure game by Sierra and the sequel to Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of the Lounge Lizards, which makes it Leisure Suit Larry 2. It was released in October of 1988 to a pretty good reception. People generally liked it quite a lot, and it's fairly interesting for a couple of reasons. The first of them being that it runs on the updated version of Sierra's engine of the time, which means that it runs on the same version of the engine that powered King's Quest IV, and that comes with all of the benefits and detriments that had, as well as being one of the very few mature-oriented games of its day. Now, we look back on it today and what's actually in it, it's really not that mature. It's very silly, of course, but it's not just that it's silly. It's that the content is really not all that bad, so to speak. It's nothing you wouldn't find in a PG-13 movie. So, when we go looking back at this thing, it's just kind of a, haha, that's cute. But the ultimate question here is, how well does this thing hold up? Does it hold up as well as Leisure Suit Larry 1 did? Because that held up fairly well. And is it actually a really good adventure game? Well, as far as the presentation goes, it really hasn't aged very well, but that's mostly because there's a lot of pixelation here, and it's kind of hard to tell what some of the objects are, which in turn makes it kind of hard to interact with certain things. Not all things, but some things. Usually you can tell there's something sticking out than usual, so it's like, oh, well, I should probably fiddle around with that and see what I can do. But occasionally you'll look at something and you just can't tell what it is until you actually consult a walkthrough or just type in all sorts of different things that it could be until you finally figure out what it is. And what ends up happening is that even though the graphics do have quite a lot of color in them, quite a lot of charm, they wear thin very quickly, and even though it was impressive for its time, it actually kind of gives you a headache now. And then there's the sound design, which is basically music and not much else. There's, of course, the Leisure Suit Larry theme that you know from the original game if you've played it, and there's a couple of other tunes, one of which is very annoying. It's played during the dating game section, and it actually gave me a headache to listen to it, so that was pretty irritating. And there's a couple of other tunes here and there. They're alright, they're nothing to write home about, but they do shake things up from the usually fairly silent gameplay. Occasionally you'll have some sound effects, but they're not well detailed because they're basically PC speaker sounds, so they're kind of loud and obnoxious, and you can't really tell exactly what a lot of them are supposed to be. Now, admittedly, this is at a time when sound cards were not really a thing, so you have to cut the game some slack. It was definitely limited by the tech of its day, but that does make going back to it so many years later all that much more difficult. But it doesn't really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that once again you are Larry Laffer, the leisure suit wearing protagonist from the original game, and this takes place immediately after the events of the original game, so there are spoilers here for that. After having basically a one-night stand that he thought was more than a one-night stand, Larry finds himself on the prowl once again, and he's looking for love in several wrong places. There's really not all that much in the way of story in this game. It really serves more as a vehicle to get from one joke to the next, and it works out okay in the game's favor, but it does mean that the story lacks a lot of consistency, and there's only a few major points throughout the entirety of it. First major point, Larry is looking for love. Next major point, he wins the lottery, and thus he goes on a cruise, which leads him into a weird storyline involving KGB secrets and things like that, and it just kind of goes all over the place and becomes very, very ridiculous. Now, it's done in a way that's very tongue-in-cheek and not meant to be taken seriously, so you can pretty much let it slide. But that lack of consistency does mean that you're kind of going, wait, what? Sometimes. But there is one major problem with the writing itself, and that is that it feels toned down from the original game. The original game was a very great anomaly in adventure games of its era. There were very few, if any, adventure games made for adults. They were mostly made to be kind of a family-friendly thing, like the King's Quest games, or even to some degree the Space Quest games. But then Leisure Suit Larry came out, and it was just this almost raunchy game. It wasn't really wildly adult or anything like that, but it was definitely meant for a more mature audience. It had a lot more jokes that only adults would have got at the time. And then you have this, where there's more kind of referential humor and more crossover humor with the King's Quest games, for example. There's actually a reference to King's Quest 4 in it, because that actually came out basically the month prior to this. And it's things like that that actually make it feel a lot more toned down, a lot more family-friendly than the previous game. Only it still has hints of mature humor here and there, like at one point you end up on a nude beach. Now, obviously, you don't really see anything because it's extremely pixelated and you just get the text saying, "Oh my god!" But other than that, it's just the kind of stuff you would find in general comedy movies of its time. So, it's not bad by any means. It is still a very funny game, but it just doesn't feel quite as much like a Leisure Suit Larry game. And then you get to the actual gameplay, which, again, is parser-based. And unlike the original game, this actually did not have a VGA remake, so it's only available in the parser-based version. And that means that you're moving around with the keyboard, whether it be the arrow keys or you can actually use the numpad to get diagonal movement. And you can also use the mouse to move around, or even a joystick if you happen to have one. But ultimately, moving around isn't quite the problem with it. It's being able to interact with things, where you actually have to type commands in, like look at sign, or just look sign. Now, usually you can omit the prepositions unless you really need something to actually do something specific. For example, there's one part of the game that's actually bugged in certain versions, where if you don't actually type out the whole sentence, it doesn't work. So you basically had to say, put the bag in the bottle, whereas normally you would just say, put bag in bottle, or something like that. And it ends up having this weird effect where I actually had to look that up. And certain times I actually did need to look up a walkthrough, because the game does not do a very good job of telling you exactly what you need to know to be able to complete the game. And this is a problem that most adventure games of that era had, where it was a parser-based game. It didn't give you a lot of feedback unless you specifically went looking for it. And so sometimes I would actually need to consult a walkthrough in order to figure out what I was supposed to do at any given point, because it's just kind of like, okay, well, I could spend this time just wandering around aimlessly until something occurred to me, or I could just look up a hint really quick. Oh, that makes sense. Why didn't the game give me some sort of hint about that? And that's kind of the problem I have with these very early adventure games, where they're parser-based, where they're not bad games by any means, but they don't do a whole lot to actually telegraph to you what you're supposed to do while being subtle about it. You see, in most adventure games later on, something they learned very quickly is that you need to be able to give hints to your player about what you're supposed to do without outright telling them what to do. See, that's part of the fun of it. It's giving them these hints and saying, okay, here's what you got. You need to figure out what to do with this. Okay, I'll think about it. I'll try to find a solution to this puzzle. And in early games like Leisure Suit Larry 2, you don't really have that as much. It's a lot harder to figure out what you're supposed to do. Now, some of it is very straightforward. Some of it you just get by trial and error. But one rule that you should have with this game is save all the frickin' time, because it is very easy to lose in this thing. If you don't do things in a very specific order, you lose, and you have to start back from your last save, which, if you're a modern gamer and you aren't used to saving constantly, will mean that you'll probably have to redo entire swaths of the game, because it doesn't autosave. That's a newer thing. That's something that didn't really come about until the 2000s. So, if you were thinking, oh, well, it's no big deal, I'll start at a checkpoint. There are no checkpoints. You have to start the whole game over. So, it's definitely got some Sierra logic going on in there, where some of the solutions are just kind of out there and ridiculous. It's not quite as bad as, say, King's Quest V, but it does have some moments like that. And it's ultimately not the best example of a Sierra adventure game. It's not bad. If you liked Leisure Suit Larry 1, you'll probably find something to like about Leisure Suit Larry 2. And if you like adventure games, you'll probably like Leisure Suit Larry 2. But it's hard to recommend as a game in and of itself. It's something you have to look at more as part of the series and part of gaming history, rather than looking at it specifically as a game on its own, because on its own, it's just kind of eh. So ultimately, I do recommend it for fans of the series if you're looking to go back into the series history. If you are planning to play through the entire series, go for it. If you're a fan of Sierra adventure games but you haven't played it before, go for it. If you're a fan of adventure games in general and you just want to see what the old adventure games were like, well, you could do a lot worse than this, but I do recommend playing the first game before you play this, because that's pretty much required to really get all that much out of it. If I hadn't played Leisure Suit Larry 1 before I played this, I probably wouldn't have enjoyed it anywhere near as much as I did. I will, of course, have a link in the video description box to where you can pick this thing up. Thanks for watching.